At 2 o'clock in the morning on January 3rd, 2026, Caracas didn't just wake up to another blackout, another shortage, another day of quiet fear. It woke up to explosions, and within hours, the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, was no longer in Venezuela. The United States says it captured him in a military operation and flew him to the U.S. to face federal charges. Venezuelans heard the news the way they've heard so many life-changing announcements in the last decade, through shaky phone videos, frantic messages, and the sudden realization that history was moving again, fast, loud, and out of their control. But here's the part that turns this from a political thriller into an economic earthquake, because almost immediately after Maduro's capture, the story stopped being only about democracy, corruption, or even drugs. It became about oil, who sells it, who ships it, who gets paid, and who gets to decide what Venezuela's recovery even means. In the days that followed, U.S. forces began seizing oil tankers in the Caribbean, part of an escalating effort to choke off Venezuelan crude flows the U.S. says are tied to sanctions evasion. And U.S. officials framed it as law enforcement, national security, and a crackdown on illicit networks. Critics called it something else: a modern oil war, fought not only with sanctions and courts, but with warships, boarding teams, and control over the cash. So today, we're going to answer one question that matters more than any headline. If the U.S. really captured Venezuela's president and is now moving to control Venezuelan oil exports, what does that mean for Venezuelans, for global energy markets, and for the future of economic sovereignty in the 21st century? Because Venezuela is not just another oil producer. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven crude oil reserves, about 303 billion barrels, roughly 17% of the global total. That number is so big it almost stops sounding real. And yet, despite sitting on that ocean of oil, Venezuela's production has collapsed over the last generation. It produces under 1 million barrels per day, down from the multi-million barrel levels it once maintained, because the country's oil system has been hollowed out by mismanagement, underinvestment, brain drain, sanctions, and infrastructure decay. That contradiction, unimaginable wealth underground, and widespread hardship above ground is the core tragedy of Venezuela, and it's also the reason Venezuela remains one of the most tempting prizes in global geopolitics. To understand how we got here, we need to zoom out. For years, the U.S. government treated Nicolás Maduro not as a normal head of state, but as a target. In March 2020, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York announced narco-terrorism and related charges against Maduro and other Venezuelan officials, accusing them of working with armed groups and trafficking networks. The U.S. State Department also announced a reward, up to $15 million, for information leading to Maduro's arrest and conviction. That wasn't symbolic. It was the U.S. publicly declaring that Venezuela's sitting leader belonged in a courtroom. Meanwhile, Venezuela's economy was collapsing into a kind of slow-motion disaster. Inflation, currency breakdown, shortages, mass migration, millions of Venezuelans leaving to survive. And through it all, oil remained the engine. Not because it was producing prosperity, but because it was still the biggest lever of power. PDVSA, the state oil company, has historically been the government's main source of revenue. When oil money flows, the state can import food, fund security forces, and keep the political machine running. When oil money dries up, everything breaks faster. But Venezuela's oil isn't easy oil. Much of it is extra heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt, thick, dense, difficult to extract, expensive to upgrade, and requiring specialized infrastructure. That means Venezuela can't simply turn on the taps like some other producers. It needs capital, technology, spare parts, reliable electricity, stable pipelines, and functioning refineries. And that's where sanctions and international politics become economically decisive. When the U.S. and other countries tightened restrictions, Venezuela's access to finance and markets shrank. It became harder to attract investment, harder to maintain equipment, harder to sell oil at normal prices, harder to get paid through regular banking channels. So Venezuelan crude increasingly moved through discounts, intermediaries, and shadow logistics, especially toward buyers like China, while relationships with countries like Russia and Iran also mattered in different ways. In other words, Venezuela's oil didn't stop being valuable. It became contested. Now, fast forward to late 2025 and early 2026, when everything accelerated. According to reporting, the U.S. began boarding and seizing sanctioned crude tankers as part of an operation the media and official statements have described as an oil quarantine, or blockade-like enforcement campaign. And then, on January 3rd, 2026, the U.S. launched strikes in Venezuela and captured Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, transferring them to U.S. custody to face charges in New York. That single event, if you strip away politics and focus on incentives, creates a vacuum. Because when a leader is removed abruptly, the question becomes, who controls the state? And in an oil state, control isn't just about who sits in the presidential palace. It's about who controls the revenue streams, who controls the export terminals, who controls the shipping lanes, who controls the accounts where the money lands. In the immediate aftermath, Venezuela's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, emerged as acting president and began signaling a new direction, calling for opening the oil industry to more foreign investment, proposing reforms, and adopting a tone that suggested warmer ties could be possible even while condemning Maduro's detention. That is not a small pivot, because for decades, Venezuela's oil story has been a tug-of-war between state control and foreign involvement, between nationalism and the need for outside capital. And now, suddenly, the country is being told it can rebuild, if it opens up. But rebuild for whom? Here's what we know about the U.S. posture since the capture. U.S. forces have continued to seize oil tankers linked to Venezuelan crude flows, including a tanker called Veronica, in actions described as enforcing sanctions and preventing evasion through shadow fleets. And U.S. officials have discussed using seized oil and proceeds in ways tied to broader plans for Venezuela's oil sector, framing it as funding reconstruction and investment. This is where the economic stakes become explosive, because if you can control exports, you can control cash. And if you can control cash, you can control politics without ever having to run the country day to day. That's why oil is not just a commodity here, it's governance. Now let's talk about the human impact, because it's easy to get lost in tanker names and sanctions jargon. For ordinary Venezuelans, the oil industry is not an abstract macroeconomic topic. It determines whether hospitals have supplies, whether the currency stabilizes or collapses, whether there's fuel at the pump, whether teachers get paid, whether families can eat without remittances. When Venezuela's oil system fails, the economy doesn't just slow down, it fractures. And when foreign powers fight over Venezuela's oil, the risk is that Venezuelans become spectators to decisions that shape their lives. That's why the post-capture political split is so dangerous. Because Venezuela already had a deep legitimacy crisis after the disputed 2024 election, with opposition figures, especially Maria Corina Machado, claiming a democratic mandate while the state institutions remained aligned with Maduro's camp. Now, the U.S. has appeared to engage with multiple Venezuelan figures in different ways, while emphasizing control over oil flows as a central tool of pressure and leverage. So, what does the war for Venezuela's oil actually look like in 2026? It's not a classic invasion with armies occupying oil fields. It's a 21st century hybrid contest with four main battlegrounds. First, the courtroom. Maduro's case is tied to U.S. federal charges that date back years, including the March 2020 SDNY announcement of narco-terrorism-related indictments. Trials aren't just about guilt or innocence. They're about narratives. If the U.S. can prove its case, it strengthens the argument that Maduro's government was not merely authoritarian, but criminal. And that framing helps justify extraordinary actions, sanctions, seizures, even military operations in the eyes of domestic and international audiences. Second, the sea lanes. Oil is only money if it moves. That's why tanker seizures matter so much. When the U.S. boards ships, it's not just intercepting barrels. It's sending a message to insurers, ship owners, traders, and banks. It's saying, if you touch this crude, you may lose the ship, the cargo, the payment, and your access to the U.S. financial system. That kind of pressure can freeze trade faster than a naval blockade ever could, because modern trade runs on paperwork, compliance, and risk management. Third, the licenses. Even during heavy sanctions, the U.S. has at times allowed limited oil activity through specific authorizations, most famously involving Chevron. These licenses are a pressure valve. They can increase supply, reduce domestic fuel price pressure in the U.S., and create leverage over Venezuelan actors by making economic relief conditional. And fourth, the future investment map. Venezuela's oil sector cannot be revived with slogans. It needs billions, possibly tens of billions over many years. It needs people, equipment, and stable rules. So whoever shapes the post-Maduro investment framework, who gets contracts, who gets equity, who gets export rights, will shape Venezuela's economic future for a generation. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question in this entire story. Is this about freeing Venezuela or about controlling the largest proven oil reserves on Earth? Here's the hard truth. It can be both. Geopolitics is rarely pure. The US can argue it's acting against alleged criminal networks and authoritarianism. But it can also be true that controlling Venezuelan oil flows weakens US rivals and strengthens US energy security and influence, especially because heavy Venezuelan crude is uniquely compatible with certain US Gulf Coast refineries designed for heavy, sour grades. And it can also be true that Venezuelans, after years of collapse, want change so badly that they may accept almost any path that promises stability, even if it comes with painful compromises. But stability has a price. Because rebuilding an oil state often means rebuilding the same dependency that made it fragile in the first place. If Venezuela's recovery is built on one promise, pump more oil, export more oil, borrow against future oil, then the country risks repeating the cycle. A cycle where the economy rises and falls on one global price chart. A cycle where politics becomes a fight over rents, not productivity. A cycle where the state is powerful when oil is expensive and brutal when oil collapses. And there's another dimension that is impossible to ignore now: climate. Some analyses and reporting have warned that a large-scale push to exploit Venezuela's heavy crude could carry an enormous carbon footprint because Orinoco oil is carbon-intensive and locks in long-term emissions. So the world faces a paradox. Venezuela's oil could finance reconstruction, but it could also deepen global climate risk. And if foreign governments and companies rush in for the reserves, the economic logic may overpower the environmental one. Now let's talk about what happens next, because as of today, January 16th, 2026, this story is still unfolding. Maduro is in U.S. custody, facing a legal process tied to long-standing U.S. charges. Delcy Rodriguez is acting president and publicly calling for foreign investment and reforms in the oil sector. The U.S. is continuing maritime enforcement actions, including tanker seizures as part of its pressure campaign around Venezuelan oil exports. And the global market is watching, because even though Venezuela currently contributes a small share of global output, the long-term prize is massive. If Venezuela ever returned to producing even 2 or 3 million barrels per day, it could reshape heavy crude markets, alter OPEC dynamics, and change the bargaining power of multiple states, from Cuba to China to the U.S. Gulf Coast refining complex. But the obstacles are enormous. Venezuela's infrastructure is degraded, its oil is hard to produce, its political system is unstable, its institutions have been hollowed out, and any perception that Venezuela's oil is being taken or externally controlled could trigger backlash, sabotage, or long-term legitimacy problems for any new governing arrangement. Because oil is not just money. Oil is identity, sovereignty, pride, and trauma. So here's the ending that no one can script yet, but everyone is betting on. If the U.S. can enforce control over Venezuelan oil flows through seizures, sanctions, and licensing, then it can shape Venezuela's economy without formally occupying it. If Venezuela's acting leadership can attract investment and restore production, the country could see real improvements: more revenue, more imports, more stability. But if the struggle turns into a prolonged standoff, legal chaos, fragmented legitimacy, and a shadow export war at sea, then Venezuela could remain trapped, rich in reserves, poor in reality. And for Venezuelans, the most important question is the simplest one. After all the speeches, all the sanctions, all the raids, all the promises, will any of this finally translate into a normal life? A salary that holds value, a hospital that functions, a country where the future isn't a gamble? Because the war for Venezuela's oil is not just a fight over barrels. It's a fight over who gets to write the next chapter of a nation that has already paid in human suffering far more than any oil field is worth. And the world should pay attention, because what's happening to Venezuela is not only about Venezuela. It's a preview of how economic power works now, not always through conquest, but through control of trade routes, financial choke points, and the invisible infrastructure that turns natural resources into political power. If you want to understand the next era of global conflict, don't just watch the front lines, watch the tankers, watch the sanctions lists, watch the licenses. Because in 2026, the new oil wars don't always look like war. Sometimes they look like a boarding ladder in the dark in the middle of the Caribbean, while an entire country waits to find out who will own tomorrow.
If you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe button for more.